239 souls. One transponder signal, cut at 1:21 a.m. on March 8, 2014, somewhere over the Gulf of Thailand. Then nothing, no wreckage for 508 days, no distress call, no explanation that has ever satisfied the families still waiting for one. Where did the aircraft finally come down? Why was its course changed? What happened during those final hours after radar contact was lost? More than a decade later, each question has generated thousands of pages of investigation, and none has produced a universally accepted answer. MH370 is only the beginning. History is filled with moments that should have been understood long ago, yet somehow never were. Across 22 mysteries, we'll follow trails that end in silence, evidence that points in conflicting directions, and events that remain suspended between fact and speculation. MH370 is where we start. It won't be the last thing tonight that never got an ending. The tarmac at Kuala Lumpur International Airport still holds the shape of routine that night. Refueling trucks idling, baggage carts trundling past, a Boeing 777-200ER glinting under floodlights, registration number 9MRO. It was March 8, 2014, and the aircraft carried 227 passengers and 12 crew, bound for Beijing on a flight so ordinary it barely registered as newsworthy. Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 pushed back from the gate at 12:41 a.m. Within minutes, it was climbing into the dark, its transponder quietly broadcasting altitude, speed, and position to air traffic controllers below, the digital heartbeat of a modern airliner going about its business. 40 minutes later, that heartbeat stopped. At 1:21 a.m., as MH370 crossed from Malaysian into Vietnamese airspace, its transponder went silent. No mayday, no warning. The last words from the cockpit, spoken to Malaysian air traffic control moments earlier, were almost aggressively mundane. "Good night, Malaysian 370. Then the aircraft simply vanished from secondary radar, as if it had been erased. What happened next has become one of the most studied anomalies in aviation history. Military radar, separate from the civilian system, appears to show the aircraft doing something inexplicable, turning sharply westward, crossing back over the Malay Peninsula, and climbing toward the Andaman Sea, far from its filed flight path to Beijing. Why would a commercial airliner with no distress call deliberately reverse course in the middle of the night? Mechanical failure doesn't usually reprogram a flight path. Human hands were on those controls. For nearly 7 hours after that, something kept flying. A satellite operated by Inmarsat, hovering in geostationary orbit, continued exchanging faint automated handshakes with equipment aboard the aircraft. Not messages, just pings, confirming the plane was still airborne, still transmitting, long after it should have been anywhere near its destination. Engineers would later use the subtle timing and frequency shifts in those pings, a technique never before used to locate a missing plane, to sketch two vast arcs across the globe where MH370 might have been at its final transmission. One stretched toward Central Asia, the other curved deep into the southern Indian Ocean, one of the most remote, least traveled stretches of water on Earth. The southern arc won out, and with it began one of the largest and most expensive search operations in maritime history. Tens of thousands of square kilometers of ocean floor mapped, submersibles deployed, years spent scanning a seabed few humans had ever seen. In 2015, a barnacle-encrusted flaperon washed ashore on Réunion Island, nearly 4,000 miles from the presumed crash site. Confirmed as part of MH370, it proved the plane had gone down somewhere in that ocean. It did not say where or why. From there, the official investigation gives way to a landscape of competing theories, each built on fragments of the same incomplete picture. Some point to the captain, citing a flight simulator found in his home with a route plotted into the southern Indian Ocean. Suggestive, investigators say, though never proven to be more than coincidence. Others suspect a catastrophic depressurization, the aircraft flying on as a ghost plane, crew and passengers already lost to hypoxia. Still, others look toward the cargo manifest, the shipment of lithium-ion batteries in the hold, and ask whether fire, not intention, wrote the ending. None of it closes the file. No wreckage of the main fuselage has ever been recovered. No black box has ever been found. The families of 239 people have spent more than a decade without the one thing every investigation is supposed to deliver: an answer. Somewhere on the ocean floor, or perhaps nowhere at all, the truth of MH370 waits. What turned that aircraft west that night? And what silence has kept it hidden ever since? Search operations of that scale are rare, vast, coordinated, expensive, and ultimately incomplete. But they are not unprecedented. Decades before satellites traced arcs across the Indian Ocean, another search moved across a very different kind of emptiness. Not water, but snow. Not an ocean floor, but a mountainside in the Ural range of Soviet Russia, where the trail of 9 hikers went cold in the winter of 1959, and where the answers, when they came, only multiplied the questions. The Ural Mountains stretch like a spine down the middle of Russia, dividing Europe from Asia, and in the dead of winter they are a place of profound, punishing silence. Temperatures fall to 30 below. Wind carves the snow into hard, sculpted drifts. It was into this landscape, in late January 1959, that 10 experienced hikers and skiers set out from the city of Sverdlovsk, led by a 23-year-old engineering student named Igor Dyatlov. Their goal was Gora Otorten, a peak whose name, in the language of the indigenous Mansi people, is sometimes translated as "don't go there." Whether that translation is accurate or apocryphal remains debated. What isn't debated is that one member of the group, Yuri Yudin, turned back early due to illness, a decision that would save his life and haunt him for the 50 years he lived afterward. The remaining 9 pressed on. On February 1st, they made camp on the slope of a mountain the Mansi called Kholat Shiako, translated, in a detail that has taken on a weight of its own, as Dead Mountain. It was here, sometime in the night, that something happened. Something that remains to this day without a fully satisfying explanation. When the hikers failed to check in as scheduled, search parties were dispatched. Weeks later, on February 26th, rescuers found the tent, and what they found made no sense. The tent had been cut open from the inside, the slashes deliberate, as though whatever was happening demanded immediate escape rather than the simple act of unzipping a flap. Footprints, some in only socks, some barefoot, led away from the tent and down the slope, toward the tree line more than a kilometer away, into temperatures that would kill an exposed person in under an hour. Why would 9 trained hikers flee their only shelter in the middle of a sub-zero night without pausing to dress? The bodies were found in stages, and each discovery deepened the mystery rather than resolving it. Beneath a large cedar tree at the forest's edge, searchers found the first 2, Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonishenko, in their underwear, evidence suggesting they had climbed the tree, perhaps to see something, perhaps to escape something, before dying of hypothermia. Broken branches on the cedar, 10 to 15 feet up, hinted at a desperate ascent. 3 more were found between the cedar and the tent, seemingly frozen while trying to return for supplies or shelter, including Dyatlov himself, one hand seemingly gripping a small birch branch. The final 4 were not found until May, buried under 13 feet of snow in a ravine, and it was here that the case moved from tragic to inexplicable. These 4 had suffered massive internal injuries. One had major skull damage, another catastrophic chest fractures compared by the examining pathologist to the kind of force produced by a car crash, and one woman was missing her tongue, eyes, part of her lips, and facial tissue. And yet there was no external bruising to suggest a blunt force beating, no sign of a struggle with another party. What could crush a rib cage without breaking the skin above it? Some clothing recovered from the bodies also tested positive for elevated radiation levels, a detail that has never been fully explained within the case's official record. The Soviet investigation, conducted under a government not known for its transparency, closed in May 1959 with a verdict that satisfied almost no one. The hikers died from a compelling natural force. The files were classified. They would not be reopened to public scrutiny for decades, and when they finally were, the world's fascination with Dyatlov Pass only intensified. Explanations have accumulated ever since, each addressing part of the puzzle while leaving the rest untouched. Soviet military testing in the area, perhaps a secret parachute mine, perhaps an experimental weapon, could explain the injuries and the radiation, but no record of such a test has ever surfaced. A rare and violent form of katabatic wind, funneled by the terrain into a slab avalanche, has gained traction among some researchers in recent years, potentially accounting for the tense collapse and the group's panicked flight. Others have pointed to infrasound, inaudible vibrations that, in theory, can produce sensations of dread and panic in the human body, a phenomenon sometimes called the fear frequency. And then there are the theories that resist conventional explanation altogether. Reports from other hikers in the region that night of strange, glowing orange spheres in the sky, and speculation, unproven but persistent, about a covert encounter with something the group was never meant to see. No theory accounts for every detail. The avalanche models struggle to explain injuries typically associated with high-velocity trauma. The military testing theory lacks documentation. The infrasound hypothesis cannot explain the missing tongue. 65 years on, the case remains formally reopened and reclosed more than once by Russian authorities, each time without full consensus. What forced 9 people to cut their way out of the only shelter they had and walk half-dressed into a mountain that killed them within hours? The snow on Kholat has long since melted and fallen again, dozens of times over. Whatever happened there that night has not thawed with it. Halfway across the world from that mountainside, in a country untouched by the Soviet Union's silence, a different kind of unsolved case was taking shape. One built not on missing files, but on letters the killer wanted the public to read. On the night of July 4th, 1969, a young couple sat parked at Blue Rock Springs, a lover's lane on the outskirts of Vallejo, California. A car pulled up beside them. A man got out, walked to their window, and opened fire. Darlene Ferrin died at the scene. Michael Majot survived, though barely, and would go on to give police a description that mattered less than what came next. Because 6 weeks later, a local newspaper received a letter, split into 3 parts and sent to 3 different outlets, each containing a piece of an encoded cipher and a demand: print this, or I will kill again. The killer signed his letters with a symbol that has since become inseparable from American true crime: a circle bisected by a cross, resembling a rifle's crosshairs. He called himself the Zodiac. What made the Zodiac different from other unidentified killers of the era wasn't just the violence, though. The violence was real and well documented. At least 5 confirmed victims between December 1968 and October 1969 in the towns and hillsides around the San Francisco Bay Area, with the killer himself claiming a number closer to 37, a claim investigators have never been able to verify or fully dismiss. What set the Zodiac apart was the correspondence. Over the following years, more than 20 letters arrived at newspapers and police departments, taunting, boastful, occasionally laced with details only the killer could have known. Some included fragments of cipher text, block letters and symbols arranged in careful, deliberate grids, as though the killer had spent real time constructing them. Why would someone committing murder also commit to cryptography? What did he believe the ciphers would prove or protect? The first of these, the 408 symbol cipher mailed in 3 parts in the summer of 1969, was solved within a week, not by the FBI or the California Department of Justice, but by a high school teacher named Donald Hardin and his wife Betty, working the puzzle at their kitchen table. The decoded message was rambling and chilling in equal measure, describing the act of killing as more satisfying than the act of hunting animals, and closing with a taunt that has been endlessly parsed by investigators since. A string of characters many believed spelled out a name, though experts have never agreed on what that name was supposed to be. Then came the cipher that wouldn't break. Mailed in November 1969, 340 characters long, arranged in a grid, it resisted every professional cryptanalyst who attempted it for 51 years. The FBI's own cryptography unit examined it. Amateur codebreakers around the world built entire hobbies around it. Some speculated the cipher was intentionally unsolvable. A piece of theater rather than a genuine message, designed to keep investigators occupied and the killer's name in print. Was the Zodiac communicating something real, or performing the idea of a message, aware that the mystery itself was more powerful than any content it could hold? In December 2020, a team of 3 amateur codebreakers, an American software engineer, an Australian mathematician, and a Belgian programmer, working independently before combining their efforts, announced they had finally cracked the 340 cipher. The FBI confirmed the solution's authenticity. The decoded text, once assembled, contained no confession, no name, no admission of guilt. Instead, it read as a kind of dark boast about the killer's belief that he would not go to what he called paradise. A message about death and the afterlife, not identity. After 51 years, the puzzle yielded an answer that solved nothing about who he was. One cipher remains unsolved to this day. The 13-character message from a 1970 letter known as the My Name Is cipher. So short that some cryptographers argue there may simply not be enough text for any solution to be verified with confidence. It sits there still. 13 characters daring anyone to finish what the Zodiac started. The question of identity has consumed almost as much attention as the ciphers themselves. Official investigations named a handful of persons of interest over the decades, most prominently a man named Arthur Lee Allen, scrutinized for years due to circumstantial ties and behavioral red flags, though DNA testing on available evidence never conclusively linked him to the crimes. In 2021, an independent group calling itself the Casebreakers announced they had identified the killer as a different man entirely, Gary Francis Post, citing photographic and circumstantial analysis, a claim the FBI publicly declined to confirm, noting the case remained open and unsolved by official standards. Handwriting analysis, DNA from envelope seals, partial fingerprints. Each piece of evidence has pointed toward possibility rather than certainty, and no name has ever been attached to the Zodiac with the kind of proof a courtroom would require. He never wrote again after the early 1970s, or if he did, nothing was ever confirmed as authentic. He was never arrested. He may have died decades ago, an old man who took his identity with him, or he may have simply stopped, for reasons no letter ever explained. The 340 cipher took 51 years to solve, and when it finally broke, it revealed almost nothing about the man who wrote it. What does that say about the 13 characters that remain? And what does it mean that a killer who wanted so badly to be read has still, after more than half a century, never truly been known? Snow again, but softer this time, fresher, still falling. Isdal means Valley of Ice, a name that has nothing to do with murder and everything to do with the terrain. A steep, wooded ravine on the outskirts of Bergen, Norway, walled in by rock and pine, cut through by a hiking trail popular with locals on weekend mornings. It was on one such morning, November 29, 1970, that a father and his 2 young daughters, out for a walk, came across something no hiking trail should ever hold: the partially burned body of a woman lying among the rocks, surrounded by objects that seemed to have been arranged or discarded with unsettling deliberateness. She would come to be known as the Isdal woman. To this day, more than half a century later, no one knows her real name. The body itself resisted easy explanation from the start. She was found badly burned, and nearby lay an empty gasoline can, along with a passport, later determined to be forged, and bottles that once held sleeping pills. The post-mortem found soot in her airways, evidence she had still been breathing when the fire reached her, but it also found high levels of carbon monoxide and traces of a sedative in her system, alongside blunt force injuries and bruising that couldn't be neatly attributed to the fire alone. Was this a suicide, staged with an almost theatrical excess of method? Was it murder, made to look like something else? Norwegian investigators, working the case in the years that followed, were never able to agree, and the ambiguity has never fully lifted. Identifying her became its own investigation, and it uncovered layers that a simple accident or suicide should never have had. Police traced her movements through hotel registries across Norway in the weeks before her death, and found she had checked in and out repeatedly under at least 8 different aliases, each with its own forged passport. Staff at the hotels remembered her as elegant, well-dressed, fluent in several languages, though her German carried what some described as a French or possibly Belgian inflection beneath it, never quite matching any single origin cleanly. She paid in different currencies. She removed labels from her clothing, in some cases picking apart the seams by hand, as though she understood exactly which details might identify her, and moved systematically to erase every one of them. When Bergen police, stumped by the case, released photographs of her belongings and asked the public for information, the response was a version of coming forward that only deepened the silence. Several witnesses reported having seen the woman in the company of well-dressed men in the days before her death. Men who were never identified and never came forward themselves. A search of a hotel room she had used turned up a notebook filled with a coded set of numbers and letters, later partially deciphered by a mathematician as recording an itinerary of European cities she had passed through, Paris, Basel, Geneva, among others, laid out with a precision that read less like a tourist's diary and more like a record kept for someone else's benefit. The espionage theory arrived early and has never fully gone away. Bergen, in 1970, sat inside a Cold War landscape thick with military installations, and Norway's position bordering the Soviet Union made it a quiet stage for intelligence activity throughout the era. A woman traveling under numerous false identities, fluent in multiple languages, careful enough to strip her own clothing of any identifying trace, meticulous enough to keep a coded log of her movements. To some investigators and amateur researchers alike, the profile fit a spy far more naturally than it fit a tourist or a woman fleeing personal trouble. Journalists writing about the case decades later uncovered documents suggesting Norwegian police had, at the time, been discreetly warned off pursuing the investigation too aggressively by intelligence services, though the full nature and origin of that pressure has never been officially confirmed. For decades, her body lay in an unmarked grave, and her identity remained a closed door. It was only in 2016 that advances in forensic science reopened the case in earnest. Researchers exhumed her remains, and used isotope analysis on her teeth and bones, a technique capable of reading, in the chemical signature of a person's own skeleton, traces of the water and food they consumed as children. Effectively, a geographic fingerprint written into the body itself. The results suggested she had spent her early years somewhere in continental Europe, possibly near the German-French border, a finding that narrowed the map without ever naming a town, a family, or a woman who might have been missing her. No name has surfaced since. No family has ever come forward to claim her. Despite international appeals, despite documentaries, despite the case's slow migration from Norwegian police files into the wider world's fascination with unsolved mysteries. She remains, in the official record, unidentified. A woman who took extraordinary care to erase herself from the world before the world had any chance to lose her. What kind of life requires that many names, that many disguises, that much vigilance against being known? And if someone spent years making sure no one could trace her, what does it mean that 55 years later no one still has? Teeth and bones speak, but so, it turns out, can a scrap of paper no larger than a thumbnail. Half a world away from that Norwegian ravine, on a stretch of sand called Somerton Beach near Adelaide, South Australia, a different unidentified body was found nearly a quarter-century earlier, and tucked into a hidden pocket sewn into the lining of his trousers, investigators would eventually find a tightly rolled piece of paper bearing two words that have never been fully explained: Tamám, Shud. The morning was December 1st, 1948. A well-dressed man was seen lying against a seawall the evening before, propped in a way passers-by assumed was simply a man resting, perhaps drunk, perhaps asleep. By morning, he hadn't moved. He was found dead, no visible wounds, no signs of struggle, dressed in a suit with the labels carefully removed from every piece of clothing he wore, a detail that would echo, decades later, in cases like the Isdal woman's, though the two were never formally connected. His pockets held an unused bus ticket, a comb, cigarettes, and matches. Nothing that named him, no wallet, no identification of any kind. The autopsy deepened rather than resolved the confusion. The pathologist noted his heart appeared abnormally engorged, his spleen strikingly enlarged, and his stomach contained what looked like the last traces of a meal, alongside evidence consistent with poisoning, though no toxicologist of the era could identify the substance responsible. It was, one examiner would later say, unlike anything he had encountered in his career. How does a fit, healthy-looking man in his 40s simply stop on a public beach with no mark of violence and no traceable poison in his blood? Weeks passed before anyone found the paper scroll, sewn so precisely into a secret fob pocket that police had missed it during the initial examination. Tamám Shud is Persian, meaning roughly finished or ended, and it was traced to the final page of a rare edition of the medieval Persian poetry collection, the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, a book of verses preoccupied, fittingly or unbearably, with mortality, fate, and the fleeting nature of life. Investigators soon located the exact copy the page had been torn from, tossed into the back seat of a stranger's unlocked car parked near the beach only days before the body was found. Inside the book's back cover, in faint pencil, was a block of capital letters, 5 lines long, that appeared to be some kind of code. That code has never been broken. Cryptographers with the Australian Navy examined it at the time and again in later decades, along with amateur codebreakers and academic cryptographers well into the 21st century. Some conclude it isn't a cipher at all, but shorthand, or the disordered first letters of a poem the man had memorized. Others insist the structure shows genuine cryptographic intent, encoding something its author very much wanted kept hidden. no solution has ever satisfied the wider community of researchers who've attempted it. Also written in the back of that book was a phone number, unlisted, which led investigators to a woman living nearby. A former nurse the case files would refer to for decades only as Justin, to protect her identity at her own request. She denied knowing the dead man when police first showed her a plaster cast of his face, though more than one investigator over the years came to believe that denial wasn't entirely truthful. She had, it turned out, once owned a copy of that same rare edition of the Rubaiyat. She never elaborated further, and she carried whatever she knew to her own grave decades later. For 70 years, the man's identity remained entirely unknown, filed under a name that was itself an admission of defeat, the Unknown Man. Theories multiplied in the space that vacuum created. Some proposed he was a spy, felled by an exotic poison during the tense opening years of the Cold War. His cipher a message meant for a handler who never arrived. Others suspected a broken heart, a man who'd loved Justin from a distance and taken his own life within sight of her home. Still, others saw nothing more than a tragic, undiagnosed medical event, made mysterious only by the absence of identification. It was DNA, not deduction, that finally cracked part of the case. In 2022, using genetic genealogy techniques and hair samples preserved in a decades-old plaster cast of the man's face, Australian researchers identified him as Carl Charles Webb, an electrical engineer born in Melbourne in 1905. It was, by any measure, a genuine breakthrough. A name, finally, after 74 years. And yet a name was never really the whole mystery. Why was Webb in Adelaide? What led to his death on that beach, with poison no one could name? Why the torn page? Why the secret pocket? Why the phone number connecting him to a woman who denied him until she died? The book said Tamám Shud, finished. But whatever story ended on that beach in 1948, its final chapter, even now, has never quite been found. 28 years before Carl Webb's name was finally confirmed, and on the opposite side of the globe from that Adelaide beach, two boys went looking for birds and found something that Brazilian police have never fully explained. The date was August 20th, 1966. The place was Vintem Hill, a steep, scrub-covered slope overlooking the city of Niterói across the bay from Rio de Janeiro. What the boys found, lying side by side in the underbrush, were the bodies of two men, dressed in suits, both wearing strange lead masks over their eyes, the kind used at the time by workers protecting themselves from radiation exposure. The men were identified fairly quickly as Manuel Pereira de Cruz and Miguel José Viana, two electronics technicians from Campos dos Goytaqueses, a city roughly 140 miles from where they were found. That much investigators established without much difficulty. Almost nothing else about their deaths has ever been resolved. The scene itself resisted simple explanation from the start. Both men were found neatly laid out on their backs, arms at their sides, as though positioned deliberately rather than having fallen where they died. There were no visible wounds, no signs of a struggle, nothing to suggest violence had taken place. And yet nearby, scattered with what investigators considered a strange, ritualistic deliberateness, were their belongings. A notebook containing a set of cryptic instructions, waterproof coats folded neatly, and small towels dampened, oddly, as though prepared for a specific and deliberate purpose that no one could determine. It was the notebook that drew the most attention and the most speculation. Inside, in handwriting later confirmed as belonging to one of the two men, was a short sequence of instructions, numbered and precise. They referenced arriving at a determined location at a determined time, taking a capsule after a specific signal, and putting on the masks in order to protect against something described only as the effects of the ether. What ether? What effects? What signal were the two men waiting for, out on a quiet Brazilian hillside with lead shielding over their eyes? The notes gave orders without ever explaining a purpose, like a script written for a scene the two men understood completely, and the rest of the world has never been let in on. The forensic examination that followed only widened the gap between evidence and explanation. Investigators were unable to determine a definitive cause of death. There was no trauma severe enough to account for it, no obvious poison detected in the initial tests, and by the time more thorough forensic techniques might have been applied, the rapid decomposition typical of Brazil's climate had already compromised much of what evidence remained. The case's original medical examiner would later say the deaths simply didn't fit any pattern he recognized from his years of practice. Theories arrived quickly, and few of them have ever gone away. One line of thinking centers on the men's known interest, according to friends and colleagues, in spiritualism and the paranormal, trance rituals, contact with the beyond, and, most specifically, a suggestion the men had been planning to use the masks and capsules to attempt some kind of otherworldly communication, believing the ether they referenced was less a chemical than a metaphysical threshold. Others take a far more grounded view, pointing to the men's known involvement in local seances and the possibility of a coordinated suicide pact, arranged with an almost bureaucratic precision that could explain the careful notes and the neatly folded coats, even if it can't explain what the capsules contained or why death came without visible cause. A third theory drifts further from either explanation. Because the men worked in electronics, and because the lead masks used at the time were specifically designed to shield against radiation, some researchers have proposed the two were engaged not in spiritual ritual, but in some kind of unauthorized or amateur experiment, testing equipment perhaps, or exposing themselves to a radioactive source under conditions they believed the masks would make safe. If true, it would mean the men died not from mysticism but from simple human error, dressed in language that only sounds otherworldly in hindsight. None of these explanations has ever been proven, and Brazilian investigators, working with the forensic tools of the mid-1960s, closed the case without a determined cause of death for either man. Attempts to revisit it in later decades have run into the same wall. The physical evidence is gone, the men who wrote the notebook are gone, and the only voices that might explain what the effects of the ether actually meant went silent on that hillside decades ago. Two men, prepared with an almost clinical precision for something they clearly expected, wearing shielding meant to protect against a danger they never named. What arrived at Vintam Hill that August evening? An experiment, a ritual, a signal that never came. Whatever they thought they had prepared for, it left no mark science has ever been able to read. From a scrub-covered hillside above Rio de Janeiro Bay, the scene shifts to something far colder and far more exposed, a jagged outcrop of rock in the North Atlantic, 7 miles from the nearest inhabited land, battered by some of the fiercest seas in the British Isles. The Flannan Isles, known to the few who ever set foot there as the Seven Hunters, sit off the western coast of Scotland, and on the largest of them, Island Moor, stands a lighthouse that in December 1900 became the site of a disappearance that maritime history has never satisfactorily closed. The lighthouse itself had only been operating for about a year, staffed by 3 keepers, James Ducat, the principal keeper, along with Thomas Marshall and Donald MacArthur, working in careful rotation with a 4th man who took his turn on shore. On the morning of December 15th, a passing steamer named the Archter noted that the lighthouse's light was not lit, an alarming detail relayed to authorities on the mainland, though poor weather delayed any response for several more days. It wasn't until December 26th that a relief vessel, the Hesperus, was finally able to approach the island. and what its crew found waiting for them there has puzzled investigators for more than a century. There was no sign of the three keepers anywhere on the island. The lighthouse itself, when the relief crew entered, told a story that seemed to begin normally and then simply stop. The beds were unmade. A chair inside had been knocked over, lying on its side as though someone had risen from it in haste. In the kitchen, an untouched meal sat on the table, and the clock, once wound and reliable, had stopped. Outside, the men found other details that only deepened the confusion. A set of oilskins and boots had been left behind, unusual for keepers heading out in December weather, since venturing onto the exposed rock without proper gear would have been dangerous even under ordinary conditions. Why would three experienced lighthouse keepers step outside, unprepared for the elements, and never return? The official log, kept faithfully by the keepers in the days leading up to their disappearance, offered fragments rather than answers. Entries described severe weather in the days before December 15th. Storms fierce enough that the men noted their own unease, and one entry, whether reflecting fact or foreboding, mentioned that Duquette had grown quiet, while MacArthur, usually the steadiest of the three, appeared to be crying. The final log entry, dated December 15th, simply noted that the storm had passed and the sea was calm, a detail that has troubled investigators for a different reason entirely. Later, checks of regional weather records suggested no storm severe enough to explain the men's alarm had actually occurred that week, though this detail remains disputed among researchers who have revisited the case with modern meteorological data. The official investigation, led by Robert Muirhead of the Northern Lighthouse Board, produced a working theory grounded in the island's known dangers rather than in anything exotic. Muirhead noted that a west-facing landing point on the island had been damaged, its iron railings bent, and a box of equipment stored more than 100 feet above sea level swept away. Evidence, he concluded, of a wave powerful enough to overwhelm that section of coast. His theory held that Duquette and Marshall, dressed for the weather, had gone out to secure equipment during or after a storm, and that MacArthur, breaking his own safety protocols in a moment of concern for his colleagues, followed without his coat, only for all three to be swept from the rocks by a sudden freak wave. It's a theory that accounts for the missing men and the abandoned boots. It does not fully account for the discrepancy in the weather records, or explain why three keepers, however concerned, would together abandon a working lighthouse without ever noting their intentions in the log they so carefully maintained. Where the official record leaves gaps, speculation has never hesitated to fill them. Some early theories, fueled by the isolation of the setting and the total absence of bodies, pointed toward foreign spies or saboteurs. Unlikely explanations that gained little traction even at the time. Others suggested a violent dispute among the three men themselves, though nothing in their service records or the physical evidence at the lighthouse supported any theory of internal conflict. And in the decades since, the case has attracted the same fringe interest that gathers around any disappearance with no bodies and no witnesses. Folklore involving the sea itself, tied to older Hebridean legends about the Flannan Isles being a place best left to the birds and the weather, uninhabited by human choice for centuries before the lighthouse was ever built. No trace of James Duckett, Thomas Marshall, or Donald MacArthur was ever found, not that December, and not in all the years since. The lighthouse itself still stands, automated now, its light still turning over an island that keeps its secret. What made three careful, experienced men leave their post so abruptly that a meal went cold and a chair was left overturned? The sea that surrounds Eileen Moore has never given an answer, and perhaps, given how thoroughly it erased every trace of them, it never intends to. Every case in this collection leaves behind a version of the same object. A chair knocked over, a coat left folded, a meal gone cold, A small domestic detail that says someone meant to come right back. Keep that thought in mind because it appears again 7 years after Island Moore's light went dark for the last time keepers ever lit it, in the Sierra Nevada foothills of California, in a case involving not one absence but 5. On the evening of February 24, 1978, 5 men left a basketball game in Chico, California, and drove into the mountains, never to be seen alive again. Their names were Ted Wire, Jack Madruga, Jack Hewitt, Bill Sterling, and Gary Mathias, 4 of them with developmental disabilities, longtime friends who played on a local recreational basketball team together, with Mathias, a Vietnam veteran who had been diagnosed with schizophrenia, serving as something of an informal caretaker within the group. They were, by every account from people who knew them, familiar with the route home. Madruga, driving his own Mercury Montego, had made the drive from Chico to Yuba City countless times. That night, the group never arrived. Instead, their car was found abandoned more than 70 miles off course, stuck in snow on a remote logging road high in the Plumas National Forest, in a direction that made no sense for 5 men trying to get home. The car had run out of gas, but it hadn't run out of options. Investigators later determined the vehicle wasn't actually stuck badly enough to explain why 5 capable men would abandon it and walk into sub-zero mountain wilderness rather than simply reversing back the way they'd come. The doors were unlocked. The keys were left in the ignition. Inside, an unopened bag of penny candy sat undisturbed on the seat, alongside a coat still folded, that none of the men had bothered to take with them into weather that would eventually kill most of them. Search parties combed the area for weeks and found nothing. No trace of any of the 5 men turned up for more than 2 months, an absence made all the more baffling by the region's relatively contained search area and repeated aerial sweeps. Then, in early June, a Forest Service worker stumbled upon a remote, padlocked summer cabin miles from where the car had been abandoned, a cabin that, when opened, revealed one final devastating piece of the puzzle. Inside, investigators found the body of Ted Wire, who had survived far longer than seems possible, judging by the state in which he was found. He had lost roughly 100 pounds, wrapped in what fabric he could gather from curtains and other cloth inside the cabin, evidently trying to insulate himself against the cold. The cabin itself contained working matches, a functioning wood stove, cans of food, and blankets, resources that, properly used, might have kept a man alive for far longer than the weeks Wire apparently survived, a detail that has troubled investigators for decades, since the presence of usable supplies makes his death, and the complete disappearance of his 4 friends, harder to explain rather than easier. Of the other 4 men, no trace was ever found. No bodies, no remains. No further belongings scattered along any trail between the abandoned car and that isolated cabin, despite the distance being difficult, though not impossible, to cover on foot even for men unfamiliar with the terrain. Why would the group split up in a snowstorm, in a mountain range none of them knew well? And why would only one of them make it to shelter, apparently alone, when all 5 had left the vehicle together? Investigators at the time and in years since have circled a handful of explanations, none complete. One theory suggests the group encountered some kind of psychological crisis, potentially connected to Mathias's schizophrenia diagnosis, that led to disorientation or a shared, mistaken belief about their location, sending them further into the wilderness rather than back toward the road. Others point to hypothermia's well-documented effect of paradoxical undressing and confused decision-making, arguing simple panic and cold-induced impairment can explain choices that look inexplicable in hindsight. A more unusual detail has kept alternative theories alive for decades. Several witnesses in a nearby community reported hearing screams on the night the men disappeared. and one resident recalled seeing unfamiliar military-style vehicles in the area at around the same time, fueling persistent, unproven speculation about some kind of encounter the men were never meant to have. Modern investigators who've revisited the file, aided by improved understanding of hypothermia and search and rescue science, generally favor the more grounded explanations. Disorientation, cold, poor decision-making compounding on itself in the dark. But grounded explanations still don't answer the specific, nagging details. The unlocked car, the untouched candy, the folded coat left behind, the cabin stocked with the very supplies that might have saved 4 more lives had anyone else found their way to it. Ted Wyer's body offered one answer and raised a dozen more. What happened to the 4 friends who never reached that cabin at all? Somewhere in the Plumas National Forest, the snow that swallowed their trail that February night has never given it back. Investigators chasing the Yuba County 5 spent months reading a landscape for clues it never gave up. 9 years later, and roughly 2,000 miles east, in Chicago, a different kind of investigator would spend months staring at something far stranger than an empty forest. 2 minutes of hijacked television static, and a man in a rubber mask who was never identified. On the night of November 22, 1987, during the 9 p.m. broadcast of the WGN TV news, engineers noticed something was wrong. For roughly 25 seconds, the station's own signal was overridden by an unauthorized transmission, the screen filling with a grainy, distorted image of a figure wearing a mask modeled after Max Headroom, a computer-generated television personality popular at the time, standing in front of a corrugated metal background that rocked back and forth as though the camera itself were unstable. No sound accompanied the intrusion. WGN's engineers regained control of the signal within half a minute, and the broadcast resumed as though nothing had happened. It was strange, but brief, and easily dismissed as an isolated, if baffling, technical failure. Then, just over 2 hours later, it happened again, this time on a different station entirely, WTTW, Chicago's public broadcasting outlet, during a rerun of a Doctor Who episode. This second intrusion lasted far longer, roughly 90 seconds, and gave the world far more to work with, and far less to explain. The masked figure appeared again, moving erratically in front of the same corrugated backdrop, at times swaying so close to the camera that the image blurred into abstraction. This time there was audio, garbled and distorted, but audible enough to make out fragments, mocking references to a WGN sports anchor, an unsettling laugh, a strange, sing-song mumbling that never resolved into anything with clear meaning. At one point, the figure removed part of the mask briefly, though never enough to reveal an actual identity. Toward the end, the person on screen was struck, apparently by an off-camera accomplice, with what appeared to be a fly swatter, and made a comment sexual in nature before the transmission cut to static and WTTW's programming resumed. What made the intrusion so alarming wasn't just its content, deliberately bizarre as it was. It was the method. Hijacking a television signal of this kind required specialized equipment and, more importantly, an amount of transmission power capable of overriding WTTW's own broadcast, which was itself being sent from a transmitter atop the Sears Tower, one of the tallest and most secure broadcast points in the country. Engineers and the Federal Communications Commission, which formally investigated the incident, concluded that whoever was responsible needed a directional antenna, precisely aimed, along with a signal strong enough to overpower a major station's professional equipment. Technical requirements suggesting real expertise, not the work of a casual prankster with access to a home camera. Who, in 1987, had both the broadcast engineering knowledge and the specific access required to pull off an intrusion of that scale, twice, in one night, against two separate stations. The FCC's investigation, run alongside inquiries by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, ultimately went nowhere. No arrests were made. No suspect was ever formally named. Despite the technical sophistication required, and despite a police report and federal case file that stayed open for years, the perpetrators, whoever they were never identified, and no one has ever come forward publicly to confess to a crime whose statute of limitations for related charges has long since expired, removing any legal risk from an admission that has still, for nearly 4 decades, never arrived. Speculation filled the vacuum in ways that mirror almost every unsolved case in this collection. Rumors circulated for years, pointing toward a pair of brothers, engineering students with access to broadcast equipment, though those rumors were never substantiated by any formal charge or public confirmation. Others in the world of amateur broadcast engineering pointed to the specific expertise required, suggesting the culprits likely worked in or around the television industry itself, perhaps with grievances against WGN in particular, given the Intrusion's reference to one of its own on-air personalities. A smaller number of theorists, drawn to the genuinely eerie visual of a masked figure appearing without warning inside a broadcast signal, have leaned into the incident's uncanny quality, framing it less as a prank than as an act of deliberate theatrical unease, engineered specifically to be unsettling to anyone watching alone. What's certain is only what aired. Roughly 2 minutes total across 2 Chicago stations of a masked man rocking in front of corrugated metal, saying almost nothing that made sense and vanishing from the airwaves as suddenly as he arrived. No fingerprints on a broadcast signal. No face beneath a rubber mask that anyone has ever definitively matched to a name. Whoever climbed to whatever rooftop or set up whatever equipment it took to override the Sears Tower's own transmission, twice, in one 9 o'clock hour in November of 1987, they did it, apparently, for 2 minutes of static and a joke no one has ever fully understood. Nearly 40 years on, the tape still exists. The person behind the mask never has. A signal without a face, transmitted by someone with obvious technical mastery who never once identified themselves. That idea didn't end in Chicago in 1987. It resurfaced 25 years later, in a place with no rooftop antenna and no corrugated metal backdrop at all. The anonymous image board 4chan, where on January 4, 2012, a single black and white post appeared, addressed to a very specific kind of person. The image was simple. White text on a black background read, "Hello, we are looking for highly intelligent individuals. To find them, we have devised a test." It was signed only 3301. Beneath the message sat a string of numbers and letters that, to most scrolling past, looked like meaningless noise. To the small number of people equipped to recognize it, it was something else entirely, an invitation into what would become one of the most elaborate, unresolved puzzles the internet has ever produced. The organization, or individual, or collective behind the message came to be known simply as Cicada 3301, and the challenge that unfolded across the following weeks moved with a level of technical sophistication that stunned even experienced cryptographers. The first clue, once decoded using a substitution cipher, revealed hidden text embedded inside a photograph using a technique called steganography. Data concealed within the pixels of an ordinary-looking image, invisible unless you knew exactly how to extract it. That led to a website, and from there, the puzzle fractured outward into a genuinely staggering range of disciplines. Classical cryptography going back centuries, obscure literary references drawn from William Blake and Aleister Crowley, number theory, ancient Mayan numerals, and musical theory encoded into audio files that had to be run through spectrogram software before a hidden image would even appear on screen. What set Cicada 3301 apart from ordinary internet puzzles wasn't just the difficulty, though the difficulty was real enough to defeat entire collaborative research teams working around the clock. It was the way the puzzle refused to stay confined to the internet at all. Solvers who worked through the digital layers eventually found clues pointing to physical locations, and posters bearing the cicada symbol and a QR code began appearing in cities scattered around the world. Warsaw, Seoul, Sydney, Miami, Moscow, and several others, seemingly placed by hand, seemingly coordinated across enormous distances by whoever or whatever was running the puzzle. How does an anonymous group organize physical postings across a dozen countries and multiple continents, timed precisely to a digital trail only a handful of people on Earth were even far enough along to follow? A small number of solvers did make it through the first puzzle's full chain in 2012, following the trail to its apparent end, though what exactly waited there has never been fully or consistently confirmed by any of them. Reports, largely secondhand and impossible to verify, describe a final message thanking participants and suggesting the recruitment process, if that's what it was, had concluded for that round. No name was attached, no organization publicly claimed credit, and then, roughly a year later, the process began again. A second puzzle appeared in January 2013, structurally similar but distinct in its specific ciphers and references, again requiring expertise across cryptography, obscure texts, and technical skills far beyond casual internet trivia. A third followed in January 2014. Each iteration drew larger crowds of amateur and professional codebreakers, and each iteration ended the same way the first one did, in near total silence, with no confirmed public account of who ultimately made it through, or what became of those who did. After 2014, an original Cicada 3301 Twitter account, treated by the community as one of the only verified communication channels, posted a final PGP-signed message stating the puzzle was over and warning that future puzzles claiming the Cicada name should not be trusted as genuine. That warning proved necessary. In the years since, numerous imitation puzzles have surfaced online, some clumsy, some fairly convincing, all claiming a lineage they cannot actually prove, which has only made verifying anything about the original 3 rounds more difficult with time. It has also fed the deepest, most persistent question hanging over the entire case. Who was actually behind Cicada 3301 in the first place? And what did they want? Theories have circulated for over a decade without ever converging on consensus. One prominent line of thinking holds that Cicada 3301 functioned as a covert recruitment tool for an intelligence agency, the puzzle's combination of cryptography, discretion, discipline, and genuine intellectual difficulty serving as an unusually effective filter for identifying and quietly approaching people with rare technical skill sets. Others believe it originated from a private cryptography or cybersecurity firm, testing potential hires through a method far more revealing than any conventional interview. A smaller, more esoteric theory points to the puzzle's heavy use of occult symbolism and philosophical texts, suggesting the organizers were less interested in technical talent than in a specific kind of intellectual or spiritual initiation, a digital age mystery school operating in plain sight of millions who scrolled past it without a second glance. No individual has ever come forward, credibly, to claim authorship. No government agency has confirmed involvement. No cybersecurity firm has taken public credit. The handful of solvers widely believed to have completed the original puzzles have, by and large, declined to discuss what happened once they reached the end, whether by choice, by agreement, or because there was simply nothing more to tell. What remains is the trail itself. Cryptic images on an anonymous forum. Posters on physical walls thousands of miles apart. A signature that appeared 3 times and then vanished. leaving behind only a warning against forgeries. Somewhere, someone built that puzzle with enough skill to humble professional cryptographers, and enough discipline to never once take credit for it. Why go to such lengths, and for what exactly were they really searching? 39 years before that first cicada image appeared on an anonymous forum, humanity received a very different kind of unexplained transmission. Not posted by a person, not signed by anyone, not even necessarily sent with intention at all. It arrived instead as a burst of radio noise, printed out in red pen on a stack of computer paper at a radio observatory in Ohio. The observatory was known somewhat informally as Big Ear, a massive radio telescope operated by Ohio State University and used, beginning in 1973, for a long-running project called SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. On the night of August 15, 1977, the telescope was doing what it had done for years, scanning the sky methodically, listening for any radio signal that might stand out from the ordinary background noise of the cosmos. Most nights produced nothing worth a second look. That night produced something else. The signal arrived on a frequency close to 14 and 20 megahertz, a spot on the radio spectrum with particular significance to astronomers, since it corresponds closely to the natural frequency emitted by neutral hydrogen, the most abundant element in the universe. A frequency scientists had long speculated any advanced civilization attempting deliberate contact might logically choose, reasoning that other intelligent species tracking the cosmos would likely already be listening there too. The signal lasted 72 seconds, the exact duration Big Ear's antenna would have taken to sweep across a fixed point in the sky as the Earth rotated beneath it, and it was powerful enough that its intensity registered 30 times stronger than the background noise of deep space. It was days later, while reviewing the printouts, that astronomer Jerry Amon noticed the sequence of characters representing the signal's strength, 6EQUJ5, a code that, when translated into signal intensity, described an unmistakable, sharply defined spike, rising and falling in an almost bell-curved pattern that matched exactly what a genuine astronomical signal, and not simple interference, should look like. Amon circled the sequence in red ink and, in the margin beside it, wrote a single word that would eventually give the entire event its name. Wow. What made the signal so tantalizing wasn't only its strength or its precise frequency, though both were striking on their own. It was what came afterward, or rather, what didn't. Despite extensive follow-up efforts, the signal has never been detected again. Big Ear itself continued scanning that same patch of sky for years afterward, and other observatories, once alerted to the finding, made their own attempts, some occurring decades later using dramatically more sensitive equipment. Nothing has ever matched it. Not once, not in over 4 decades of listening, has anything resembling the wow. Signal reappeared from that same region of space. The signal's origin point sits in the constellation Sagittarius, and for years the closest identifiable star in roughly that direction, a sun-like star catalogued as HD 164595, drew significant attention from researchers hoping to narrow the source to something concrete. But Big Ear's design, while excellent for detecting signals, was notably poor at pinpointing their exact origin with precision, since the telescope used 2 feed horns rather than 1, and researchers have never been able to determine with full confidence which of the 2 horns actually received the signal, or whether the true source might lie somewhere else within that broader region of sky entirely. Even the most basic question, exactly where in space this came from, remains only partially answered. For years, the leading, most cautious scientific explanation held that some form of terrestrial interference, a passing satellite, a military transmission, or some kind of signal bouncing unpredictably off orbital debris, most likely accounted for what Big Ear recorded, even if no specific source was ever identified retroactively. That explanation gained a serious, well-documented challenge in 2017, when astronomer Antonio Perez proposed that the signal may have originated from a pair of comets, 266 P. Chi Christensen and P2008Y2, whose hydrogen clouds happened to be passing through that region of sky on the night in question, potentially generating a natural signal on that same significant frequency. Follow-up observations by Perez's team reported detecting radio emissions from those comets consistent, in his assessment, with a natural explanation. That comet theory, however, has faced substantial pushback from other astronomers in the field, including Jerry Amon himself before his death, and from the broader SETI research community, who note that comets are not typically strong enough radio emitters to produce a signal of that magnitude, and that the timing coincidence, while intriguing, doesn't fully account for the signal's specific characteristics. The debate over the comet explanation remains unresolved and, at points, genuinely contentious within the scientific literature, a rare case of a mainstream natural explanation failing to achieve the consensus that would normally close a case like this, which leaves the signal essentially where it started nearly 50 years ago: authentic, strong, recorded with clear scientific instrumentation, matching almost precisely what researchers had theorized an intentional interstellar transmission might look like, and never repeated, never conclusively sourced, and never definitively explained by any single theory that has satisfied the wider astronomical community. It has become, over the decades, something of a touchstone in the search for extraterrestrial life, not because anyone can prove what caused it, but because no one has ever been able to fully rule out the most extraordinary possibility either. Jerry Amon, in later interviews, remained notably cautious about his own famous exclamation, careful never to claim the signal proved contact with anything beyond Earth, insisting only that it was unexplained, and that unexplained was not the same as impossible. Big Ear itself was dismantled in 1998, torn down to make way for a golf course expansion, taking with it any chance of comparing new observations against the exact instrument that first caught the signal. Somewhere in the direction of Sagittarius, 72 seconds of radio energy passed across a telescope in Ohio, and then simply stopped, never to return. Was it a natural burst from a passing comet, an earthly signal misread by unfamiliar instruments, or something that briefly touched Earth's listening ear and then moved on, deliberately or otherwise? Whatever it was, it wrote itself once into the data, and it has never written itself again. A message, printed once and never repeated, aimed at whoever happened to be listening on the right frequency, in the right place, at the right moment. That description fits a radio signal from deep space. It also fits, almost exactly, several hundred small pieces of asphalt-colored linoleum embedded directly into the pavement of city streets across America, each one carrying a message meant to be read by strangers who never asked to receive it. They're known as the Toynbee tiles, and the oldest confirmed sightings date to the early 1980s, discovered embedded in the asphalt of major intersections, first noticed in significant numbers around Philadelphia, before researchers realized similar tiles had been quietly appearing in cities throughout the United States, and eventually in several South American cities as well. Each tile is small, roughly the size of a license plate, made from layered linoleum in a way that suggests real craft and preparation rather than a spontaneous act of vandalism, and each one carries some close variation of the same cryptic message embedded permanently into the road surface. Toynbee idea in movie 2001, resurrect dead on planet Jupiter. The phrase makes a strange kind of partial sense and then collapses into confusion almost immediately. Toynbee is widely believed to reference Arnold J. Toynbee, a British historian known for his sweeping 12-volume study of the rise and fall of civilizations, a scholar whose work touched, among countless other topics, on humanity's relationship with mortality and historical memory. 2001 almost certainly points to Stanley Kubrick's 1968 film, 2001, A Space Odyssey, itself preoccupied with questions of consciousness, evolution, and transformation beyond death. But how those two references connect to resurrecting the dead on Jupiter, and why that idea needed to be pressed into hundreds of city streets across a continent, has never been explained by anyone willing to put their name to it. What makes the tiles more unsettling than a simple piece of street art is the method of their placement, which has puzzled researchers for decades. The tiles appear to have been installed directly into active roadways, at major, often heavily trafficked intersections, embedded with enough precision and durability that many have survived years, in some cases decades, of vehicle traffic driving directly over them. Installing a tile that way, without detection, in the middle of a busy street, would seemingly require either extraordinary boldness in broad daylight or a carefully planned operation under cover of night, timed to traffic patterns most residents never think twice about. Researchers who've studied the tile's construction believe the creator likely used a technique involving asphalt, crack filler, or tar paper layered beneath the tile itself and later ignited or melted by the heat of passing traffic, fusing the piece permanently into the road below without ever requiring the installer to dig, drill, or draw attention. For years, the tiles were treated as an isolated, if strange, curiosity, noticed mainly by pedestrians who happened to glance down at the right stretch of pavement. That changed as amateur researchers, and eventually documentary filmmakers, began cataloging sightings and comparing notes, discovering that some tiles included additional text beyond the core message, fragmentary, often paranoid-sounding passages referencing a media conspiracy, warnings against journalists, and hostile references to a small number of specific individuals and institutions, phrased with an intensity that suggested the tiler believed themselves to be genuinely persecuted or surveilled. Some tiles referenced needing to work in secrecy, specifically because of this perceived threat, adding another layer of mystery to an already opaque set of messages. Was the creator responding to a real conflict, an imagined one, or performing a kind of narrative for an audience that had no way of verifying any of it? The most substantial break in the case came through the independent research of a filmmaker named Justin Duerr, who spent years tracking sightings, interviewing residents near tile locations, and slowly assembling a portrait of a possible creator. Duerr's research pointed toward a reclusive man from Philadelphia named Severino Verna, sometimes associated with the name James Morasco, who had reportedly made statements to acquaintances decades earlier, referencing the exact philosophy embedded in the tiles. A belief, apparently sincere, that human consciousness could theoretically be transferred to another planet after death, using Jupiter specifically as the destination. Verna's own family, when eventually located and asked about the connection, offered accounts that were compatible with, but never fully conclusive of, his direct involvement, and Verna himself, extremely reclusive by all accounts, has never given a public, on-record confirmation, leaving even this most substantial lead resting on circumstantial testimony rather than any direct admission. Complicating the picture further, tiles have continued appearing well after the period most closely associated with any single named individual, including sightings reported in the years following Verna's presumed connection to the earliest tiles, some found as far away as South America, embedded in similar fashion, carrying variations of the same core message. Are these later tiles the work of the original creator, still active and still unidentified beyond circumstantial research? Are they copycats, inspired by the growing subculture of researchers and documentary attention the tiles themselves generated? Or is there a possibility, considered by some researchers, that more than one person was involved from the very beginning, working from a shared, private philosophy that outsiders have never fully accessed? No definitive answer has ever closed the case in the way a confirmed identity and confession would. Verna has never spoken publicly to confirm or deny the connection researchers built around him, and no other individual has ever come forward as the Tyler, or Tylers, responsible for a project spanning decades and multiple countries. What remains, embedded permanently into intersections most drivers cross without ever glancing down, is a message insisting that death itself might be reversible, if only humanity looked toward Jupiter. A claim its author, whoever they finally were, seemed to believe passionately enough to risk installing it, piece by piece, into the street beneath everyone else's feet. Why choose the road itself as the canvas, a place demanding permanence and risking discovery with every passing car? And what precisely did the person behind these tiles believe they were resurrecting? Themselves, someone they'd lost, or simply an idea they needed the whole world to step over? A soft popping sound, like rain hitting a windshield, except the sky that morning was clear. That's how several residents of Oakville, Washington, would later describe the strange sound accompanying what fell from the sky over their small town on the morning of August 7, 1994. A light, gelatinous substance falling in fine sheets and blobs, coating cars, lawns, and rooftops across the area in a fine, jelly-like film that no one in town had ever seen before, and no one could immediately explain. Oakville is a modest, quiet logging town in western Washington state, population well under 1,000, the kind of place where an unusual weather event might normally pass as local curiosity rather than genuine mystery. What happened instead unfolded over roughly 6 weeks, beginning with that first August fall and repeating several more times through the following weeks, each incident leaving behind the same strange, gel-like residue, and each one followed by something considerably more troubling than a strange smell or a sticky lawn. Local residents, and eventually their pets, began falling ill. The most widely reported case involved a woman named Beverly Roberts, who told local news outlets, and later, state health investigators, that she had gone outside during one of the falls to gather a sample of the substance for her own curiosity, only to fall seriously ill within hours, developing symptoms consistent with a respiratory infection severe enough to require hospitalization. She was, by her own account and by contemporaneous local reporting, in good health before the exposure. Other residents reported milder but still unusual symptoms in the days following each fall: flu-like illness, skin irritation, headaches clustering in a pattern that seemed, to many in town, too coincidental to dismiss as ordinary seasonal illness. Local veterinarians also documented a spike in sick and, in several unconfirmed but widely discussed cases, dying pets, with dogs in particular reported to have grown lethargic or unwell after contact with the gel or with lawns where it had fallen. Understandably alarmed, Oakville residents and local officials pushed for testing, and multiple agencies eventually became involved, including the Washington State Department of Health and, notably, laboratories connected to the federal government, given the substance's unknown composition and its apparent link to human illness. Early field tests, conducted shortly after the first fall, detected the presence of 2 specific types of bacteria in samples of the gel: Pseudomonas fluorescens and Enterobacter cloacae, both organisms capable, under the right circumstances, of causing illness in humans, particularly in people with compromised immune systems, though neither is considered especially dangerous to a healthy adult under normal exposure. That finding, rather than closing the case, deepened it. Pseudomonas fluorescens in particular is not a bacterium typically found occurring naturally at high concentrations in open air or rainfall, which raised an uncomfortable question state investigators were never able to fully answer. How did the substance become contaminated with that specific organism? And was the bacteria itself the actual cause of residents' symptoms, or simply a secondary contaminant that colonized a substance already present in the gel for entirely separate, still unidentified reasons? Further laboratory analysis, conducted at a federal facility, found the samples also contained white blood cells, a detail that struck investigators as particularly strange, since white blood cells are components of living tissue, animal or human, and their presence suggested the gel might be biological in origin rather than a simple industrial byproduct or naturally occurring phenomenon. Official explanations circulated in the following months, though none arrived with full consensus or complete confidence. The most widely cited theory proposed that the substance originated from a Navy operation, potentially connected to the practice of releasing biological or chemical countermeasure material during military testing exercises conducted somewhere over the region, with some researchers speculating the gel might represent a byproduct of efforts to disperse or neutralize algae blooms, a practice that, if it occurred, was never formally confirmed by military sources willing to speak on record. Others in the scientific community proposed a more mundane origin, suggesting the material may have been a naturally occurring cluster of jellyfish or marine invertebrate remains, potentially picked up by aircraft or weather systems from coastal waters and deposited inland, with the white blood cells and bacteria simply representing the natural decomposition of that biological material, rather than evidence of anything engineered or exotic. Neither explanation, however, has ever been formally confirmed as the definitive answer, and Oakville's town government, along with several residents, expressed lasting frustration with what they viewed as an investigation that identified components without ever assembling them into a coherent, agreed-upon origin story. No agency, military or civilian, has ever issued a conclusive final report naming an exact source, a specific aircraft, or a documented military operation responsible for what fell on the town that August, and repeated through the weeks that followed. The Oakville Blobs have since settled into an unusual category among American unexplained phenomena. Not quite dismissed as myth, since the physical evidence, lab results, and hospital records are well documented and a matter of public record, but never quite solved either, since no institution has ever taken clear, sourced responsibility for explaining precisely what fell from the sky, why it carried living cellular material, or why it seemed to make an otherwise healthy woman and several of her neighbors' pets seriously ill. Residents of Oakville still remember that August, the sound like light rain on a clear morning, the strange film left across their lawns and cars, and the illnesses that followed close behind it. What exactly fell over that small logging town more than once across 6 unexplained weeks in 1994? And if the substance genuinely carried living cells, as federal lab results suggested, whose cells were they, and where, exactly, did they originate before they came down over Oakville's quiet streets? Bacteria and white blood cells, cultured under laboratory lights, in the end explained everything about the Oakville Blobs except the one thing anyone actually wanted to know. Some mysteries resist not because evidence is missing, but because the evidence, however carefully gathered, refuses to add up to a single conclusion, a problem that returns now to a torn page of poetry and 5 lines of block capital letters, found in the back of a book on an Australian coastline decades before Oakville's lawns were ever coated in gel. This chapter belongs to the code itself, not the man who carried it. The specific cluster of scribbled letters recovered from the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam in 1948, a fragment that has now outlived every other piece of the Somerton man case, including, eventually, the mystery of his own name. The code consists of 5 short lines, written in pencil, in capital letters, on the inside back cover of the book. Unlike a conventional message, the lines don't read as words, or even as recognizable syllables. They appear instead as a compressed block, letters stacked with no obvious spacing, no punctuation, and, in one especially debated detail, what looks like a line struck through partway down the block, as though the author began again, or corrected an error mid-thought. Was that stray line a mistake, a second draft layered over the first, or a deliberate part of the cipher's own structure? Investigators have never agreed, and the ambiguity alone has shaped decades of competing analysis. From the moment the code became public, in the early stages of the original 1948 investigation, Australian naval intelligence took an active interest, a detail that has fed speculation for more than 70 years. Naval cryptographers examined the letters using the code-breaking techniques of the era, and their internal assessment, later summarized publicly, concluded the text's structure was consistent with a genuine cipher rather than a random scrawl, though they were unable to break it using any conventional method available to them at the time. Why would naval intelligence, rather than ordinary homicide detectives, take the lead on analyzing 5 lines from a paperback book of poetry, unless something about the case had already signaled a dimension beyond an unexplained death on a public beach? Statistical analysis conducted decades later, once computing power made large-scale letter frequency comparisons possible, produced its own conflicting signals. Some researchers running the code against known patterns of the English language found the letter distribution close enough to natural language frequency to suggest the text likely represented real words, disguised through substitution or transposition rather than pure randomness. Other analysts running comparable tests argued the sample was simply too short, at just under 50 characters, to draw any statistically meaningful conclusion either way. A code that short, they note, could resemble structured language by chance alone, without actually containing any encoded meaning at all. The theories built on top of that ambiguity span a wide range, few of them ever eliminated entirely. One prominent line of thinking treats the code as a genuine cipher key, potentially related to a one-time pad, a form of encryption favored by intelligence agencies during the Cold War precisely because, done correctly, it is mathematically unbreakable without the corresponding pad, which, if it ever existed for this case, was never recovered. If true, the code's resistance to decades of attempted solutions wouldn't reflect a failure of cryptography at all, but simply the method working exactly as designed. A second, more skeptical theory holds that the lines represent nothing more than a personal shorthand, perhaps the first letters of a poem or set of phrases the dead man had memorized, private enough to look like a cipher without ever being intended as one, a memory aid rather than a message. A third theory, less widely embraced but never fully dismissed, connects the code directly to the phone number written elsewhere in the same book's back cover, the number that led investigators to the woman referred to for decades only as Jestin, suggesting the lines might encode something personal between the two of them, a private reference only she could have read, and one she reportedly never volunteered to explain during her lifetime. Modern attempts to solve the code haven't stopped. Amateur cryptographers and academic researchers alike continue to submit proposed solutions, occasionally with real publicity, though none has yet achieved the kind of broad, professional consensus that would formally close the case the way, in a very different field entirely, genetic genealogy was eventually able to close the question of the man's own identity. The code, unlike the man himself, has outlasted every technique brought against it, cryptographic and forensic alike. That contrast is, in its own way, the strangest part of the whole case. Investigators can now say, with confidence built on DNA and genetic genealogy, that the dead man was Carl Webb, born in Melbourne in 1905. And yet the 5 lines he, or someone connected to him, left behind remain exactly as opaque today as they were the week they were discovered. Immune to 77 years of naval cryptographers, university mathematicians, and amateur codebreakers working with tools its original author could never have imagined. A name was recovered from bone and blood. The code, so far, has given up nothing at all. What was Carl Webb trying to remember, or protect, or send? 5 short lines, written in pencil, meant for no eyes but his own. Or perhaps for exactly one other person who never told anyone what they meant. From a torn page of poetry on an Australian beach, the trail moves now to a place with no page, no code, no body at all, only a forest and the memory of what happened to it. Central Siberia, the Podkamennaya Tunguska River Basin, a region so remote in 1908 that it would take Russian scientists nearly 2 decades to reach the site of the very event that had, by then, already flattened an area of wilderness larger than many modern cities. At approximately 7:14 in the morning, on June 30th, 1908, the sky over this desolate stretch of taiga split open. Witnesses as far as 60 kilometers away described a column of bluish light, nearly as bright as the sun, moving across the sky, followed by a flash and a sound that multiple accounts compared to artillery fire, heard, remarkably, in villages hundreds of kilometers distant. The blast that followed knocked people off their feet, shattered windows across a wide radius, and, most dramatically, flattened an estimated 80 million trees across roughly 2,050 square kilometers of forest. The trunks left lying in a distinctive radial pattern, all pointing outward from a central point, as though some enormous hand had pressed down from directly above and pushed the entire landscape flat in every direction at once. What makes the Tunguska event singular among the disasters catalogued in the 20th century is a detail that, on its surface, should have made the investigation simpler rather than more difficult. There is no crater. For an explosion estimated to have released energy equivalent to somewhere between 10 and 15 megatons of TNT, several hundred times more powerful than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima, the complete absence of an impact crater, or any confirmed meteorite fragments at the site, has remained the single most persistent puzzle at the center of the case for well over a century. The scientific world didn't even learn the full scale of what had happened for years. Russia, in 1908, was still under the rule of the Tsar, its scattered rural population largely illiterate, its bureaucracy slow, and its infrastructure thin across Siberia's vast distances, and the region itself was so remote and sparsely inhabited that, remarkably, no confirmed human deaths were ever recorded, despite the sheer scale of destruction. It wasn't until 1927 that a Soviet mineralogist named Leonid Kulik led the first scientific expedition into the area, and what he found, after days of difficult travel through terrain still scarred nearly 2 decades later, confirmed the scale of the disaster while deepening its central mystery. Kulik documented the flattened forest, the radial pattern of fallen trees stretching for kilometers in every direction, and trees at the very center of the blast zone left standing upright but completely stripped of their branches and bark, a pattern consistent, he noted, with a shockwave and thermal blast originating from above the ground, rather than from an object that had struck the earth directly. And yet, despite extensive searching, Kulik's team found no crater, no significant metallic debris, and none of the fragments one would ordinarily expect to recover from a meteorite impact of that scale. That absence became the foundation for the mainstream scientific explanation that has dominated Tunguska research ever since: an airburst. Under this theory, a relatively small asteroid or the icy fragment of a comet, estimated at somewhere between 60 and 190 meters across, depending on the specific model used, entered Earth's atmosphere at extremely high velocity, and detonated several kilometers above the ground, rather than surviving intact all the way to the surface. An explosion of that kind, occurring in the air rather than on impact, could account for nearly every physical detail investigators eventually catalogued: the radial flattening of trees, the branch-stripped trunks directly beneath the blast, the absence of a crater, and a thermal flash bright enough to be reported by witnesses dozens of kilometers away. Modern astronomers point to comparable, if far smaller, airburst events as supporting evidence, most notably the Chelyabinsk meteor that exploded over Russian skies in 2013, an event captured extensively on dashboard cameras and confirmed through recovered fragments, offering a modern, well-documented example of precisely the kind of atmospheric detonation Tunguska researchers believe occurred in 1908, albeit on a dramatically smaller scale. The airburst theory, while broadly accepted within mainstream astronomy, has never fully closed every question the case raises, and several persistent details continue to trouble researchers who've spent careers studying the site. Chief among them is the composition puzzle. If a rocky asteroid detonated with that much force in the atmosphere, researchers would expect to find, scattered across the blast zone, at least some trace of meteoritic material, tiny fused spherules of rock or metal formed under the extreme heat of atmospheric entry. Some such microscopic spherules have, in fact, been recovered from soil and peat samples taken at the site over the decades, and their chemical composition has been cited by researchers as broadly consistent with an extraterrestrial origin. But the quantity recovered remains, by most assessments, smaller than models would predict for an object of the size believed necessary to produce an explosion of that magnitude, leaving open the question of what, precisely, vaporized so completely that it left behind only a fraction of the material scientists expect to find. That gap has left room for a genuine, still active scientific debate over exactly what kind of object caused the explosion. Some researchers favor a stony asteroid, citing the blast's specific characteristics and airburst altitude as most consistent with rock rather than ice. Others argue more strongly for a cometary fragment, composed largely of ice and dust, reasoning that such an object would be more likely to vaporize almost entirely upon atmospheric entry, accounting for the scarcity of recovered debris far better than a rocky asteroid model would. A more recent and considerably more contested hypothesis, proposed by a Russian research team in 2020, suggested the object may not have detonated at all in the traditional sense, but instead grazed the Earth's atmosphere and continued back out into space. A near miss rather than a full atmospheric destruction, a theory that remains a minority position within the field, and has drawn significant skepticism from other astronomers who find it difficult to reconcile with the blast's observed characteristics. Beyond the mainstream astronomical debate, Tunguska has also, unsurprisingly given its scale and its blank spot where a crater should be, attracted more than a century of speculation reaching well beyond conventional science. Some early 20th century researchers, working before the airburst theory had gained full acceptance, proposed a massive natural gas explosion, venting up from geological deposits beneath the Siberian taiga, though this theory has struggled to account for the specific radial pattern of destruction and the reported aerial fireball witnesses described. Others, drawn to the event's genuinely strange environmental aftermath, point to a documented and still debated anomaly. Forest regrowth in the years following the blast reportedly showed unusually accelerated growth rates in some affected areas, a detail some fringe researchers have connected to speculative theories involving anomalous radiation, while mainstream foresters attribute the same growth pattern to entirely ordinary ecological succession following a major disturbance, with young trees simply benefiting from the sudden abundance of sunlight and nutrients released by the fallen canopy above them. The theory that has drawn by far the most public fascination, however, remains the least scientifically supported. The possibility that Tunguska represented not a natural airburst at all, but some form of technological accident, ranging from a hypothetical antimatter reaction to, in its most speculative form, an extraterrestrial spacecraft experiencing some kind of catastrophic failure in Earth's atmosphere. No physical evidence recovered from the site over more than a century of investigation supports any technological or artificial origin, and the vast majority of the scientific community regards the natural airburst explanation, whether from asteroid or comet, as by far the most consistent with the available evidence. Still, the theory persists in popular culture precisely because the crater that should exist, and doesn't, leaves a physical gap that continues to invite explanations. Science alone hasn't been able to fill with complete certainty. More than 115 years later, the Tunguska event remains, by most measures, the largest impact event in recorded human history, and also one of the least physically confirmed. Researchers have narrowed the range of plausible explanations considerably since Kulik's first expedition in 1927, and the airburst model commands broad scientific respect. But broad respect isn't the same as final proof, and the specific object, its exact composition, its precise size, and the full explanation for how so much destructive force could arrive from the sky and vanish almost entirely without a physical trace, has never been definitively settled to the satisfaction of every researcher who has studied it. Somewhere above that remote stretch of Siberian forest, on a June morning in 1908, something arrived from beyond the Earth with enough force to flatten 80 million trees and then largely disappeared, leaving behind scorched, radiating rows of fallen timber and almost nothing else. What was it exactly? And if an object powerful enough to level a forest the size of a major metropolitan area can enter our atmosphere and leave behind this little physical trace, what, if anything, would give us more warning the next time the sky does something science still can't fully explain? Every mystery in this collection eventually arrives at the same wall: physical evidence that raises more questions than it answers. Tunguska left behind trees and no crater. What follows leaves behind a body, catalogued in extraordinary forensic detail, and a killer's name that has never once been confirmed, despite 7 decades of investigators trying. Los Angeles, January 15, 1947. A vacant lot along Norton Avenue in the Leimert Park neighborhood, weeds overgrown along the sidewalk. The kind of unremarkable urban space easy to walk past without a second glance. A mother out walking with her young daughter that morning did not walk past it. What she found in the weeds, and immediately reported to police, was the body of a young woman, mutilated in ways so severe and so deliberate that the responding detectives, veterans of a department that had seen plenty of homicide cases by 1947, would later describe it as among the most disturbing crime scenes any of them had ever encountered. The victim was soon identified as Elizabeth Short, a 22-year-old woman originally from Massachusetts who had come to California, as thousands of young women did in that era, drawn by the pull of Hollywood and the loose promise of reinvention it offered. The press, within days, had already given her a name that would eclipse her own: the Black Dahlia, a nickname reportedly drawn from a film noir released the previous year. The Blue Dahlia, combined with Short's own habit, remembered by acquaintances of wearing her dark hair styled with flowers and dressing in black. The nickname stuck immediately, and with it came a level of press coverage that transformed the case almost overnight from a local homicide investigation into a national sensation, one whose grip on public fascination has, remarkably, never fully loosened in the 78 years since. The crime scene itself was what made the case so immediately, disturbingly notable. Short's body had been severed in half at the waist, drained of blood, and posed deliberately in the lot rather than simply discarded, arranged with a precision that suggested to investigators the killer had taken time at the scene rather than fleeing in haste. The body showed no blood at the location itself, indicating she had been killed elsewhere and transported to the vacant lot afterward, meaning whoever was responsible had access to a vehicle, privacy for an extended period of time, and enough composure, chillingly, to clean the body before positioning it for discovery. The autopsy documented extensive torture that had occurred prior to death, along with lacerations at the corners of her mouth, extending toward her ears, a specific and deliberate wound that has, over the decades, become one of the case's most infamous and most frequently referenced details, drawing repeated comparisons in later true crime writing to similarly staged facial mutilations in other unsolved cases. Comparisons that have never been forensically substantiated as evidence of any direct connection. The Los Angeles Police Department, under enormous public and press pressure, mounted what was, for its era, an exceptionally large investigation, reportedly interviewing several hundred suspects over the following months and years, a number that itself speaks to how completely the case captured the public imagination. And this points to one of the strangest features of the entire Black Dahlia file, the sheer volume of people who inserted themselves into it. Investigators received, by some counts, in excess of 60 confessions in the years following the murder, an extraordinary number for any single homicide case, and virtually every one of them was eventually dismissed as false. The confessors either unable to provide details only the true killer could have known, or contradicted outright by physical evidence recovered at the scene. What draws that many people to falsely claim responsibility for a murder this brutal? Some criminologists studying the phenomenon point to the case's sheer notoriety, suggesting the intense press coverage itself created a kind of morbid celebrity that certain disturbed individuals wanted, however perversely, to claim for themselves. Amid that flood of false confessions, a smaller number of genuine suspects drew sustained, serious investigative attention, though none was ever formally charged, and the case remains to this day officially unsolved. A man named Leslie Dillon, a former mortuary attendant with an unsettling personal correspondence history involving murder and dismemberment, briefly became a leading suspect after his own letters and statements to a psychiatrist raised concerns detailed enough to warrant extended police interrogation, though he was never charged, and detectives ultimately could not connect him definitively to the crime. The theory that has drawn the most sustained modern attention, however, comes not from official department files, but from a retired LAPD homicide detective named Steve Hodel, who, after his father's death in 1999, discovered old photographs among his father's belongings that Hodel believed resembled Elizabeth Short. That discovery launched Hodel into a personal, years-long investigation of his own father, Dr. George Hodel, a prominent Los Angeles physician with documented connections to the era's Hollywood social circles, and, based on what Steve Hodel has described as extensive circumstantial and forensic research, including matching a handwriting analysis to notes police at the time believed came from the killer, he came to believe his own father was responsible not only for the Black Dahlia murder, but potentially for a string of other unsolved homicides from the same period. The theory, laid out across several books Steve Hodel has published since, has drawn significant public attention and a degree of support from some retired law enforcement figures who reviewed portions of his research. It has also drawn substantial skepticism from other investigators and researchers who note that no physical evidence directly and conclusively ties George Hodel to the crime scene, that the handwriting analysis remains contested rather than definitively confirmed, and that the case, built largely by a son investigating his own deceased father, carries an inherent difficulty in being tested with the same rigor an independent, contemporaneous investigation would require. Other researchers, working independently of the Hodel theory entirely, have proposed alternative suspects over the decades, including a violent former boyfriend of Short's and several individuals connected loosely to the same Hollywood social scene the hoodoo theory centers on, none of which has ever produced the kind of forensic confirmation needed to close the file. The LAPD itself has, at various points, acknowledged George Hodel as one name among the case's many historical persons of interest, without ever formally naming him or anyone else as the confirmed killer. What makes the Black Dahlia case endure, beyond even its genuine brutality, is this same unresolved tension that runs through so much of this collection. An enormous quantity of documented evidence, physical, forensic, and investigative, that has never quite assembled itself into a single, agreed-upon conclusion. Detectives in 1947 worked the case with real diligence, using the forensic tools available to them at the time. Researchers and amateur investigators have continued working it in the decades since, armed with tools those original detectives never had. And still, 78 years on, no prosecutor has ever stood in a courtroom and named, with legal certainty, the person responsible for what happened to Elizabeth Short in that Limert Park lot. She came to Los Angeles like so many young women of her era, hoping to become someone the world would remember. In the darkest possible sense, she did. What she never received, and what her case has never fully delivered in the 7 decades since, is the one thing every unsolved murder ultimately withholds from the people left behind: a name, spoken with the kind of certainty that closes a file, rather than simply adding another theory to an already crowded shelf. 25 years before Elizabeth Short's body was found in that Los Angeles lot, a much smaller, much quieter piece of ground in rural Bavaria absorbed a killing that would prove just as resistant to explanation, despite unfolding somewhere far more isolated than a city street, a remote farmstead where, for days after the murders occurred, no one outside the property had any idea anything was wrong at all. The farm was called Hinterkaifeck, a small, isolated homestead near the village of Wangen in Bavaria, Germany, reachable only by a narrow path that cut through several hundred yards of dense forest before opening into the farmyard itself. It was home to the Gruber family: Andreas Gruber, his wife Cecilia, their widowed daughter Victoria Gabriel, and Victoria's 2 children, 7-year-old Cecilia and 2-year-old Joseph, along with a maid the family had recently hired. On the last day of March 1922, all 6 people at Hinterkaifeck were killed, struck down with what investigators determined was almost certainly a mattock, a farm tool resembling a pickaxe, and their bodies were discovered days later only when concerned neighbors and local officials, alarmed that the family hadn't been seen and that the children hadn't attended school, finally came to check on the property themselves. What investigators found upon entering the farm made an already disturbing crime scene considerably stranger. 4 of the victims, Andreas, Cecilia, Victoria, and her young daughter, were discovered in the barn, arranged in a manner suggesting they had been lured there one at a time rather than attacked together, their bodies stacked and partially covered with straw. The maid and the youngest child, Joseph, were found inside the farmhouse itself, killed separately from the others. The methodical, staggered nature of the killings, along with the deliberate concealment of the bodies under straw in the barn, suggested to investigators a killer who had taken considerable time at the scene, who understood the farm's layout well enough to isolate victims individually, and who had, chillingly, remained on the property for an extended period afterward rather than fleeing immediately. That lingering presence is what transforms Hinterkaifeck from a tragic, isolated act of violence into something considerably harder to explain. Investigators established that the murders had actually occurred on March the 31st, but the bodies weren't discovered until April 4th, 4 full days later, and evidence gathered during that gap indicated the killer, or killers, had continued living at the farm throughout much of that period. The Gruber's dog was found tied up, apparently having been secured deliberately rather than left to roam, and neighbors interviewed after the fact recalled smoke rising from the farmhouse chimney on days after the murders had occurred, at times when every member of the household was already dead. Someone had been feeding the farm's livestock in the days following the killings. Someone had been cooking in the kitchen. Local investigators, piecing together the timeline, concluded that whoever committed the murders had not run from the scene at all, but had instead stayed behind, moving through the dead family's home, eating their food, tending their animals, sleeping, presumably, somewhere on the property, for the better part of 4 days before finally leaving before neighbors arrived. Why would a killer linger at the scene of 6 murders for 4 days, rather than fleeing immediately? What explains a decision that calculated, that composed, unfolding inside a house where the bodies of an entire family lay undiscovered just outside? No definitive answer to that specific question has ever been established, though the detail alone has ensured the case's lasting notoriety among criminologists and historians who've studied unsolved European homicides. There were warning signs, investigators later determined, stretching back well before the murders themselves. Details that in hindsight suggested the family had sensed something was deeply wrong in the weeks leading up to their deaths. Andreas Gruber had reportedly told neighbors and acquaintances that he'd heard footsteps in the farmhouse attic on multiple occasions. Footsteps that couldn't be explained by anyone who was supposed to be living there. He also mentioned finding a newspaper on the property that none of the family members recognized or recalled purchasing, and, more unsettling still, discovering a set of footprints in the snow leading from the edge of the surrounding forest directly toward the farmhouse, with no corresponding footprints leading back out again, as though whoever made them had arrived and simply never left. The maid the family had hired shortly before the murders reportedly quit after only a single day of work, telling acquaintances the property felt haunted, unsettled by sounds and disturbances she couldn't otherwise explain, though she was persuaded to return and was among those killed weeks later. The Bavarian police investigation that followed the discovery of the bodies was, by most later assessments, badly compromised almost from the outset. An overwhelming number of curious locals and officials reportedly moved through the crime scene in the hours after the murders were discovered, well before it had been properly secured or documented, contaminating evidence and disturbing the scene in ways that would hinder forensic analysis for decades afterward. Despite an investigation that extended across the following years, and despite more than 100 individuals reportedly questioned as potential suspects, no one was ever formally charged with the Hinterkaifeck murders, and the case was eventually left open, unresolved, in a way that would come to define it for the century that followed. Suspicion within the local community centered most persistently on a man named Lorenz Schlittenbauer, a neighboring farmer and the biological father of Victoria's youngest child, Josef, whose paternity had reportedly caused friction within both families. Schlittenbauer was questioned repeatedly over the years, and some investigators, both at the time and in later re-examinations of the case, considered him the most plausible suspect based on motive and his familiarity with the property, though no physical evidence was ever produced sufficient to charge him, and he maintained his innocence until his own death decades later. Other theories advanced over the years have ranged from a robbery gone catastrophically wrong to a vagrant or drifter who had been secretly living in the farm's attic for some time prior to the murders, which would explain both Andreas Gruber's reported footsteps and the killer's apparent comfort remaining on the property afterward, to more elaborate theories involving inheritance disputes and long-simmering resentments within the extended Gruber family itself. Modern forensic re-examinations, including a renewed police investigation launched in 2007 using updated techniques unavailable in 1922, managed to develop a partial genetic profile from evidence preserved from the original case files, though even that effort, more than 8 decades after the murders, was unable to produce a conclusive match or identify a confirmed suspect with legal certainty, and the case was once again closed without resolution. More than a century later, Hinterkaifeck endures as one of the most studied unsolved murder cases in German history, not simply for its brutality, but for that specific, unshakable detail that separates it from almost every other case in this collection. A killer who didn't run, who stayed inside a dead family's home, ate their food, tended their animals, and slept somewhere within sight of the barn where 4 bodies lay hidden beneath straw. Who was patient enough or cold enough to do that? And what, in the end, made them finally decide it was time to leave? Footprints leading toward a house with none leading away, that image stays with you. 53 years later, and a different continent removed, another set of unexplained objects would surface not from snow, but from soil, dug up by a boy in his own back garden in the north of England, in a discovery that would eventually pull in druidic legend, forensic science, and a claim of the supernatural that has never been fully resolved. The town is Hexham, Northumberland, an old market town with roots stretching back to Roman Britain, layered with centuries of history along the border country between England and Scotland. In February 1972, an 11-year-old boy named Colin Robson was digging in the back garden of his family's home on Reed Avenue when his spade struck something solid buried in the soil. What he pulled out of the ground were 2 small carved stone heads, roughly the size of tennis balls, crude in their execution but unmistakably deliberate, each fashioned with deep-set eyes, a flattened nose, and a thin straight line for a mouth. Colin and his brother Leslie brought the heads inside, and what began as a child's curious garden discovery would, within months, become one of Britain's most persistently debated cases of unexplained phenomena. The heads themselves, on close examination, appeared distinct from one another despite obvious similarities in style. One was carved with what looked like a more clearly feminine appearance, its hair rendered in a bob-like style, while the other appeared more masculine, its features slightly heavier and more angular. Archaeologists and antiquarians who examined the heads in the weeks following their discovery noted their resemblance to a specific and much older category of stone carving found throughout Celtic Britain. So-called Celtic head cults, votive stone heads believed to have held ritual or religious significance for pre-Roman and Romano-British populations, for whom the human head was thought to hold particular spiritual power, sometimes associated with wells, boundaries, or household protection. If genuine, the Hexham heads would represent a tangible link to a religious practice more than 15 centuries old, unearthed by complete accident in a modern residential garden. That possibility alone would have made the heads a significant archaeological curiosity. What made them something considerably stranger was what the Robson family reported happening in their home almost immediately after the heads were brought inside. Family members described a series of disturbing incidents in the weeks that followed, unexplained sounds throughout the house at night, objects reportedly moving on their own, and, most alarmingly, multiple accounts from family members describing a strange, half-man, half-animal figure witnessed moving through the house in the dark, a presence some later, informally, associated with a werewolf-like entity, though no consistent, detailed description was ever agreed upon by everyone who claimed to have seen it. Was the household genuinely experiencing something connected to the heads themselves, or had the unsettling nature of the discovery, combined with the child's or family's suggestible imagination, produced its own kind of self-reinforcing fear in a home that had, until February 1972 reported nothing unusual at all. The heads eventually passed from the Robson family to a neighboring family named Dodd, and it was in the Dodd household, according to later accounts collected by researchers investigating the case, that similar disturbances were reported to continue, described independently by a family with no prior connection to the Robsons' experiences, a detail that some researchers have treated as lending a degree of credibility to the broader pattern, since two separate households, occupying two separate homes, reported comparable phenomena after taking possession of the same objects. Anne Ross, a respected academic archaeologist and recognized expert in Celtic art and religion at the time, took a serious scholarly interest in the heads once she learned of their discovery, examining them directly and offering her professional assessment that their carving style was genuinely consistent with ancient Celtic stonework, lending real academic weight to the possibility that the heads were far older than the modern garden they'd been buried in. Ross's own connection to the case, however, took an unusual turn that has become one of its most frequently cited and most disputed details. According to accounts Ross gave in later interviews, she herself reported experiencing a disturbing encounter after the heads were brought into her own home for closer examination, describing a nighttime visitation from a wolf-like upright creature that she said passed through her house, an experience she found significant enough to discuss publicly in the years that followed, despite the obvious tension between that account and her own academic credentials. Why would a trained archaeologist, whose scholarly reputation depended on rigor and credibility, choose to publicly attach her name to an experience so difficult to substantiate through any conventional method? Ross herself never fully resolved that tension in her own public statements, maintaining both her professional assessment of the head's likely antiquity and her personal account of what she experienced after bringing them into her home. The case took its most significant turn away from the supernatural and toward a far more mundane, if still not fully conclusive, explanation, when a local man named Desmond Craigie came forward years later, claiming he had personally carved the two heads himself decades earlier, sometime in the 1950s, originally intended as a gift or decoration for his daughter, and that he had buried them in the garden of the Rita Avenue property, a home he confirmed he had once lived in himself before the Robson family moved in. If accurate, Craigie's account would resolve the origin question entirely, transforming the Hexham heads from an ancient Celtic religious artifact into a 20th century garden ornament, buried and forgotten, then unearthed decades later by a boy with no idea what he'd actually found. That resolution, however, has never been as clean as it initially appeared. Some researchers who compared Craigie's account against his own family's recollections found inconsistencies in the details and timeline he provided, and others have questioned why, if his story were true, the heads bore stylistic characteristics specific enough that a trained Celtic scholar like Anne Ross would assess them as genuinely ancient, rather than as an amateur mid-century carving. Craigie himself died not long after coming forward, without ever fully clarifying the discrepancies some researchers identified in his claim, leaving his account as the most plausible explanation available without ever being fully forensically confirmed. Compounding the frustration for researchers ever since, the original Hexham heads themselves have been lost. They passed through several hands after the initial period of study, and at some point in the years that followed, their exact whereabouts became untraceable, meaning any modern attempt to apply updated forensic dating techniques that might finally settle the question of their true age once and for all, has no physical object left to examine. What remains are photographs, contemporary academic notes, and the conflicting personal testimonies of everyone who handled them before they disappeared. So the case sits, suspended between a scholar's professional assessment of ancient craftsmanship and a local man's decades later claim of a mundane 20th century origin, with the one piece of evidence that might have definitively settled the matter now missing entirely. Were the Hexham heads a genuine fragment of Britain's pre-Roman religious past, disturbed from centuries of undisturbed rest by a boy's garden spade? Or a grieving craftsman's private gift, misread by frightened households and eager researchers into something it was never meant to be? Without the heads themselves, no one may ever fully know. And whatever walked through those two Hexham houses in 1972, real or imagined, has never been explained either. 8 centuries before a boy's spade struck stone in a Northumberland garden, another English village encountered something pulled not from the ground, but seemingly from nowhere at all. 2 children, found wandering at the edge of a field, whose origin no one in that village could explain then, and no historian has fully explained since. The village is Woolpit in Suffolk, England, its name itself drawn from old wolf pits once dug in the surrounding countryside to trap the animals that roamed the region during the medieval period. Sometime during the reign of King Stephen, in the middle of the 12th century, most commonly dated to around 1150, villagers harvesting in the fields near a set of these old wolf pits came upon 2 children, a boy and a girl, standing at the field's edge, disoriented, clearly distressed, and, according to the 2 principal medieval chroniclers who separately documented the event, unmistakably green in the color of their skin. The 2 accounts that have preserved this story for modern historians, one written by the chronicler Ralph of Coggeshall and the other by William of Newburgh, agree on the story's central, strangest details, despite being recorded independently, and, in William's case, likely compiled second-hand rather than from direct witness testimony. Both chroniclers describe the children as speaking a language no one in the village could identify or understand, dressed in clothing of an unfamiliar material and style, and refusing, at least initially, to eat any of the food offered to them by the villagers who took them in. According to both accounts, the children would only accept raw green beans, or, in some translations, broad beans still in their pods, and reportedly ate them in an unusual manner, splitting the stalks open rather than the pods themselves, before other food was gradually introduced into their diet over the following weeks. The children were taken in by a local landowner, identified in the historical record as Sir Richard de Calne, and it was in his household, according to both chronicle accounts, that the boy, weaker from the outset, fell ill and died not long after their arrival. The girl survived, and over time, as her diet shifted to include a wider range of food, her skin color reportedly changed as well, gradually losing its green tint until she came to resemble, in the chronicler's words, an ordinary young woman. She eventually learned to speak English well enough, according to William of Newburgh's account, to describe where she and her brother had come from, a land she described as perpetually twilight, without a visible sun, separated from Woolpit by a wide river, a place she referred to as St. Martin's Land, where, she claimed, everyone and everything shared the same green coloring she and her brother had arrived with. According to her own account, as recorded by the chroniclers, she and her brother had been tending their father's flock when they heard a loud noise, sometimes translated as the ringing of bells, and followed the sound into a cave or underground passage, wandering through darkness until they emerged, disoriented, into the bright sunlight of the Woolpit field where the villagers found them, unable afterward to locate their way back through the passage that had brought them there. She reportedly went on, per the chronicle, to live an ordinary life in the region, eventually marrying a man from King's Lynn, and, according to some later genealogical research building on the original account, working in service for a period at the household of Sir Richard de Calne himself. What makes the story of the Green Children of Woolpit so unusual among medieval folklore is precisely the fact that it isn't typically classified as folklore at all by the historians who've studied it most closely. Ralph of Coggeshall and William of Newburgh were not writing fantastical tales in the tradition of Arthurian romance or saints' legends. Both were considered relatively careful, credible chroniclers by the standards of their era, and William of Newburgh in particular was known among medieval historians for a comparatively skeptical, rational approach to the events he documented elsewhere in his writing, which has led some modern historians to treat the Green Children account with more seriousness than a typical medieval legend might otherwise receive. Why would two independent, generally reliable chroniclers, writing in an era not lacking for genuine folklore and religious mythology, choose to record and preserve this particular story as something closer to reported fact? The explanations proposed by historians in the centuries since span a wide range, and none has achieved full, decisive consensus. The most widely cited mainstream theory centers on the children's green skin tone and their reported unfamiliar language, proposing the two were likely Flemish immigrant children, orphaned or separated from their parents, amid the documented persecution and violence directed at Flemish settlers in that region of England during the Civil War-era conflicts of King Stephen's reign. Under this theory, their green coloring would be attributable to a real medical condition known as chlorosis, sometimes historically called green sickness, a form of anemia associated with severe dietary deficiency that was known, in period medical understanding, to produce a distinctly greenish pallor in malnourished patients, particularly younger ones, a condition that would have resolved naturally, exactly as the chronicles describe, once the surviving girl's diet improved over time. Their apparently unintelligible language, under this theory, would simply have been Flemish, unfamiliar to Suffolk villagers of the period, and St. Martin's Land, a half-remembered, traumatized child's description of a Flemish village, possibly one called Fornham St. Martin, located a plausible distance from Woolpit itself. That explanation accounts for a great deal of the story without ever fully closing every detail the chronicles preserve. It doesn't fully explain the specific, vivid description of a sunless twilight land the girl reportedly described once she'd learned enough English to communicate clearly, nor the account of emerging from an underground passage after following a mysterious sound, details that read as considerably stranger than what a simple case of displaced, malnourished immigrant children traveling overland would typically produce. Some historians studying the case have proposed the underground passage detail may reflect a genuine, if disorienting, escape through an actual cave system known to exist in that region of Suffolk, with the Twilight Land representing a child's frightened, half-remembered impression of the tunnel's darkness itself, colored by trauma and retold and reshaped over the months and years before the story was finally being recorded by chroniclers. Others, less inclined toward a fully grounded historical explanation, have suggested the story may represent a garbled, distorted memory of a genuinely unusual, unexplained event, arguing that the specificity and consistency of certain details, the diet of raw beans, the gradual fading of the green coloring, the description of an underground journey, feel too oddly particular to have been entirely invented by two independent medieval writers working without coordination. A smaller, more speculative reading of the tale has, in more recent centuries, framed it as one of history's earliest recorded accounts, resembling later folklore, involving otherworldly or fairy encounters, a category of story common enough across medieval Britain that some researchers see Woolpit's account as an early, unusually well-documented example, rather than something entirely unique. Nearly 900 years on, no single theory has managed to fully account for every surviving detail of the Woolpit Chronicles, and the true origin of the two children, whoever and whatever they actually were, remains genuinely undetermined by historical consensus. Were they simply displaced, malnourished children of a persecuted immigrant community, their color and language misunderstood and slowly mythologized by a village unfamiliar with either. Or did something happen in that Suffolk field in the middle of the 12th century that two careful, respected chroniclers felt compelled to record precisely because it genuinely defied the explanations available to them at the time? The field outside Woolpit has been farmed for centuries since. Whatever passage the children described, if it ever existed at all, was never found again by anyone who went looking. A language no one in the room could identify. That detail from Woolpit turns up again, 6 centuries later, except this time no one has ever managed to explain it away as simply Flemish. This time, the language itself may not exist anywhere else on Earth. Locked inside a climate-controlled vault at Yale University's Beinecke Rare book and manuscript library sits a small volume, roughly the size of a modern hardcover novel, bound in vellum, its pages worn soft by centuries of handling. Catalogued simply as MS-408, it's known to the wider world by a different name, taken from the antiquarian book dealer who brought it to modern attention in 1912, the Voynich manuscript. Radiocarbon dating conducted in 2009 placed the manuscript's vellum firmly within the early 15th century, sometime between 1404 and 1438, confirming the book is a genuine medieval artifact rather than a later forgery, which, if anything, has only deepened the puzzle at its center since dating the object has done almost nothing to explain what's actually written inside it. The manuscript runs to roughly 240 surviving pages, filled from cover to cover with fluid, confident handwriting in a script that resembles no other known alphabet, medieval or otherwise. The writing flows easily across the page, without the hesitation or corrections one would expect from someone laboriously inventing nonsense on the spot, and it follows internally consistent statistical patterns, the kind of letter frequency and word structure real languages typically display. A detail that has convinced generations of cryptographers the text likely encodes actual meaning, rather than functioning as an elaborate, meaningless hoax. And yet, in more than a century of sustained attempts by some of the most capable codebreakers in modern history, not one has ever produced a solution the wider academic and cryptographic community accepts as genuine. The pages themselves are organized into several distinct sections, each built around a different visual theme, and each raising its own separate set of questions. A substantial portion is devoted to detailed botanical illustrations, plants rendered with careful, deliberate line work, root systems and leaves and flowers depicted in vivid color. Except that botanists who've examined these illustrations have been unable to match the majority of them to any known plant species, medieval or modern, leaving open the question of whether the manuscript's illustrator was depicting real but unidentified regional plants, working from garbled second-hand descriptions, or inventing them entirely as part of whatever purpose the book was meant to serve. Another section, often called the balneological section by researchers, is filled with small, nude female figures bathing in interconnected pools and tubes of green liquid. Imagery that has drawn comparisons to alchemical or anatomical traditions without ever being definitively tied to either. A further section presents elaborate astronomical or astrological diagrams, circular charts filled with symbols and figures whose specific system, if there is one, has never been successfully matched to any known medieval cosmological tradition. Attempts to break the manuscript's code have occupied a genuine who's who of 20th and 21st century cryptography. William Friedman, one of the most accomplished codebreakers in American history, whose work was instrumental in breaking Japanese military ciphers during the Second World War, spent years of his career, on and off, attempting to crack the Voynich text, ultimately without success, and reportedly grew convinced toward the end of his life that the manuscript represented an early, elaborate attempt at a constructed language rather than a straightforward substitution cipher for any known tongue. British and American intelligence codebreakers examined the manuscript during and after World War II, applying the same statistical and pattern analysis techniques that had proven so effective against genuine wartime ciphers, and came away without a confirmed solution. In the decades since, the manuscript has become a persistent subject for computational linguists, and more recently, for researchers applying machine learning and artificial intelligence models trained on large bodies of historical language data, hoping modern computing power might succeed where human cryptographers repeatedly failed. So far, none of these efforts has produced a decoded solution that has held up to peer scrutiny. That hasn't stopped a long recurring pattern of claimed breakthroughs, each announced with real confidence, and each ultimately failing to gain lasting acceptance. Various researchers over the decades have proposed the manuscript encodes early Slavic dialects, a lost or extinct natural language, an early form of shorthand Latin, or a genuine constructed language invented from scratch, centuries before conlangs became a recognized field of linguistic study. A 2019 claim by a University of Bristol academic asserting the text represented an abbreviated form of medieval Latin describing women's health and herbal remedies, generated substantial press coverage before other Voynich researchers and medieval linguists identified significant methodological problems with the analysis, and the claimed solution failed to achieve broader academic acceptance. Each new attempt follows a similar arc. Initial excitement, media attention, and then eventually a quiet retreat, as other specialists examine the proposed solution and find it doesn't hold up against the manuscript's full text. The theories addressing the manuscript's actual origin and purpose have proven just as varied and just as unresolved as the theories attempting to translate it. Some historians favor a relatively grounded explanation. The manuscript has a genuine, if now obscure, medical or pharmacological text, written in an invented cipher specifically to protect proprietary herbal or medical knowledge from being freely copied by rivals, a real, if now untranslatable, concern of its era. Others, noting the confident, error-free flow of the unknown script, have proposed the manuscript may represent an elaborate hoax, created specifically to be sold to a wealthy medieval patron eager for arcane knowledge, with the meaningless but convincing script generated through some systematic method designed to mimic the statistical properties of real language without actually encoding anything at all. Neither theory has ever definitively closed the case, and the radiocarbon dating that confirmed the manuscript's genuine medieval age has, if anything, made the hoax theory harder to dismiss and harder to fully accept in equal measure, since a medieval forger capable of producing text this internally consistent would represent its own kind of unexplained achievement. More than 110 years since the manuscript resurfaced into modern hands, and roughly 6 centuries after someone first pressed ink into that vellum, no cryptographer, linguist, historian, or algorithm has yet produced a translation the wider research community accepts as genuine. Somewhere in those 240 pages, in careful, unhurried handwriting, someone in the early 15th century wrote something down, deliberately, in a script built with enough internal logic to survive 600 years of expert scrutiny without ever giving up its meaning. Was it real knowledge, hidden behind a cipher clever enough to still be working? Or was it never meant to say anything at all?